The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the executive editor of Conservative Home, standing in for Paul Goodman. With me, of course, is Jacob Rees Mogg. Jacob, you've been on holiday.
I have, yes. My wife kindly took me to Florence for my 50th birthday, which was magnificent. It was wonderful. A few days away.
It's a remarkable city in many ways, as well as a remarkable country for its, particularly that era, of course, of city-state Italy is kind of particularly exemplified by Florence.
It's absolutely staggering, and we were very lucky. We were staying just outside Florence in the hills, and therefore had the most wonderful view of the city. And you see this plain that has been completely built up, surrounded by hills, so good defensive base for a city. And as you go round the city itself, you see the extraordinary wealth that they had in the late medieval period and the buildings that flourish because of that. And it is such a remarkable and beautiful city.
And Italy today, of course, is perhaps a cautionary political example for some of Britain's political parties, where you have the possibilities that are talked about in the UK of major long-standing parties being supplanted by new entrants has actually happened in Italy. You now have a government composed of what were once insurgent parties. I
think this is a very important lesson for democratic politicians. Parliament has set its face against the people in this country, and the people won't put up with it. Very often people say to MPs, or say to me, "Your boss, Theresa May." I always correct them and say, my boss is not Theresa May, my boss are the electors of North East Somerset, to whom I'm accountable and whom I'm responsible, and who may fire me without notice at any election. And what has unfortunately happened is that Parliament has decided to ignore the result of the referendum, to try and frustrate Brexit, and to try and deliver a scheme that leaves us half in, half out of the European Union. And the recent sets of election results have shown that that is for the birds.
Is this now a genuinely existential risk for the main parties, Conservatives included, of course, in the UK, in the way that it has been for the legacy parties, in a way, in Italy?
I think it is. Look at the punishment that the Conservatives got at the local elections and at the European elections for failing to deliver Brexit on the 29th of March. If the Conservatives don't deliver Brexit on the 31st of October, it is hard to see why those voters who've gone off to the Brexit party would come back. And therefore, the Tory party could find it's coming to the end of its long history unless it delivers. If it does deliver, then we can come back together. Bear in mind, Lord Ashcroft, your proprietor's polling, that showed that 67% of people who had voted Conservative in previous elections voted for the Brexit party. That's the biggest possible threat. And
among those Brexit party voters who are former Conservative voters, from our own survey before the election and from YouGov since the election, somewhere around 60% of Conservative Party members. I mean, that's a remarkable thing to happen. That's different to a party simply appealing to the public unsuccessfully. It's a party losing its own matter, its own body to another.
That's absolutely right. And I noticed the same thing when addressing Conservative associations before the election. If I asked them how many of you are going to vote for the Brexit party, a whole forest of hands went up. So it was all of a piece, the polling, your surveys, what one was finding in terms of personal experience. And these are staunch Conservatives. I was very interesting. I went to speak for Dan Boucher, the candidate in Wales, lead candidate in Wales. And I was there basically to launch his campaign. We got on very well. You know, there was a great crowd of people, staunch Conservatives, people who'd been doing work for the Conservative Party for decades, until I said they had to vote Conservative on the 23rd of May, at which point they hissed me. It was quite remarkable that we were just as Eurosceptic as each other. Everything was very cosy. But the key question was, if I vote Conservative in the European elections, aren't I giving Mrs May a vote of confidence? And does that mean that we have no change? And I think that was very powerful for Conservatives, and is why so many of them left us.
Which Downing Street unwisely reiterated a couple of days before the election, effectively, that actually the Prime Minister was intending to take some form of succour from Conservative votes when the European elections came. Which seemed another unwisdom in what could charitably be described as a chain of them.
Absolutely, and the bringing forward of the withdrawal bill, which made things even worse.
Were you in the country during the European elections, or were you?
I left on the Friday morning, having voted Conservative, actually in London, because I was in London that day, and I had no hesitation in voting Conservative. As soon as I got into the polling station, there was nowhere else that my vote could possibly have gone.
So you were away when the results themselves came in?
I was listening to Sky News in a hotel room just outside Florence, in a very comfortable hotel room, it has to be said, and waiting for my sister to be interviewed, who got triumphantly elected in the East Midlands, which I'm very proud about. I think she did brilliantly well, even though she's standing for the wrong party.
And you've spoken to congratulate her?
Yeah, of course I have. We speak the whole time, yes.
And she's well?
Yeah, flourishing. She'll be taking a podcast soon. I'm now referred to as Nunziata's brother, which I take as the highest compliment.
Deservedly so on in her case. And obviously the next big target for the Brexit Party, and the next big challenge, therefore, for the Conservative Party, comes this week in Peterborough. You were there, I think, 2 or 3 days ago.
I was there on Friday, and we've got a good candidate. Paul Bristow is a very decent man, deeply Eurosceptic, and I wish him well on Thursday. There was a good team out. And he seemed to have the base of support there. There is obviously a challenge from the Brexit Party.
Is there a hope, perhaps, that the Liberal Democrats, also surging on the Remain side, could perhaps cause some problems for the Labour Party and split things away there into effectively a four-way race?
Let's not try and forecast the election result, because it's very difficult for politicians to say honest things on what's going to happen with an election just before it takes place. But let's talk more generally, if you don't mind, about the Lib Dems and Labour, because yes, this is a real challenge to the Labour Party. And in your question about the existential threat, you mentioned both parties. And what seems to me to be clear is the Conservative Party has to be a Leave party and the Labour Party has to be a Remain party. But that really changes things. It changes voter outcomes. It means that in the next election it's going to be harder for the Conservatives to win central London seats, but it's going to be harder for Labour to win Durham seats. This is a fundamental change. You ought to have Vernon Bogdaner on, who I think is absolutely brilliant, to explain how the change in voting patterns is taking place and the breakdown traditional class-based party loyalties into one based on Brexit. And that's really difficult because, especially with the Labour Party, it seems to have a disproportionate number of the seats where over 60% of people voted one way or another, either Remain or Leave. Lots of Conservative seats, like mine, were sort of 52-48, were on the margin, much like the nation as a whole. But you go from Chakra Muna's seat, ex-Labour obviously, but Labour victory, to Yvette Cooper's seat, and you see a completely different set of results, really very marked. And that coalition is breaking down, and the Lib Dems are forcing the pace on that because Labour faces losing to the Lib Dems if it doesn't become a Remain party.
I confess I had the rather challenging job in the referendum in my spare time of running the Vote Leave campaign in Chakra Muna's seat, which was slightly harder territory than some places. Described to me at one point as the Rorke's Drift of Vote Leave, which... well,
we won Rorke's Drift, so don't... At least it wasn't the and one of...
mainly through persistence.
Of Vote Leave.
But in that sense, this leads us in a way into the discussions and debates that are happening around the leadership contest, because we have this peculiar position. We were discussing a couple of days ago in our new Tory leadership election podcast, Paul and I, the challenging fact that you have an election which effectively has to speak at different stages to 3 different electorates, MPs, members, and eventually, of course, the winner must become Prime Minister of the whole country. And that first hurdle to get across, it might be the correct strategy to say, for the Conservative Party, to say, to have a majority government in future, we need to pivot in order to be a more Leave-based party. It's rather harder, I think, to convince all Conservative MPs when some of them are the losers in that pivot. Can candidates really get across that hurdle to start off with?
Well, I mentioned my sister a moment ago. She sent me this morning the political calculus results as they would be from the European elections for the East Midlands, which would leave only Patrick McLaughlin as the Conservative MP in the East Midlands. A lot of my fellow MPs will be looking at what happened in the European elections, look at what that would do to their seat, and will recognise that if they want to remain members of Parliament in a party that has any hope of being elected, the Conservative Party has to deliver on Brexit, which is what we said we would do in the manifesto. And it's a more positive thing to do. It's not just electorally necessary. It also has a chance of reuniting the country. The reason, or part of the reason, the division is so great now is that it's worth fighting over because it hasn't yet happened. Once it's fact, once it is the new reality, very few people are going to be campaigning to rejoin the European Union. So delivering it begins the process of healing. But it also respects democracy. And I think a lot of MPs recognise that it is in their interest to vote for a leader who takes us out clearly and cleanly.
So the message would be that not only does this argument appeal to, or it ought to appeal to those Conservative MPs in leave-leaning constituencies who will stand to be potentially punished by Brexit Party competition if there's a further failure to fulfil Brexit, but that actually it also offers the best chance to some of those in Remain England, because it is hard to see why those MPs.
That's absolutely right, because in Remain England the issue is then settled. And if you look at polls, 67%, 60 to 70% of people have consistently said that they want the deal settled, want it done, and that they accept the result of the referendum. That doesn't mean if there were another referendum they wouldn't vote the way they did last time, but they've accepted it. There's only about 20% of head-banging Remainers, or Guardian readers, basically, though the Guardian probably quite pleased to get 20% of the country reading it. But you know broadly what I mean. And BBC presenters. But that's basically the extent of it.
And in terms of that, therefore, potentially, you would have, if the Liberal Democrats, for example, have managed to establish themselves as they seem to thus far, the kind of hard Remain party, that would leave them in a kind of continuity, kind of pro-EU UKIP kind of position, UKIP of old, with a kind of grievance-based politics, with a certain base, but without you think, the same base that they've just shown in the Euros.
Absolutely. And if you look at my part of the world, and Somerset and around, and the Lib Dems did well there, but it's an area that voted to leave, by and large, other than Bath and Bristol themselves. The cities didn't, but by and large, the rural areas all voted to leave. And so the Lib Dems doing well is at least in part a pure protest vote playing on all your houses, particularly in the local elections when a Brexit party wasn't standing.
Do you think there's much mileage? There's been some very clever polling-based arguments, I think, delivered to Labour MPs by some of the second referendum and Remain campaigners to make the case that actually, even in leave-leaning constituencies, the majority of Labour's vote actually came from Remainers. Do you think there's much kind of leverage to that argument? Do you think you could actually see a position where a Remain-leaning Labour Party manages to get itself in on a minority in those seats?
No, I think the issue there is that where you have these very high Leave votes, those people were Labour voters in 2010 and 2015. By 2017, of course, some of them were peeling off because they didn't like Labour's position. But even in 2017, they were still nominally in favour of implementing the referendum result. And so they're still able to hold on to some of their Leave support. If they were to lose all of it, then I think the clever polling doesn't really help them win the seats.
Back to the leadership race, like a more internal Conservative discussion, at least at this stage. What do you think is going on? It's quite unusual, I think, to see the field of candidates continuing to grow, even at this stage. We're recording this on the Monday. We're up to, I think, 13 candidates. There are a couple more actively considering, at least one of whom appears to be gathering data where possible from potential supporters. Is it really sustainable to have such a wide field at this stage?
Can you list the people who are standing at the moment?
I could give a go at a decent chunk of them, but I suspect if I was to try, I'll end up mortally offending one or two.
That's the problem, isn't it? It's a bit like trying to remember the 7 deadly sins. One gets to number 6 and then can't remember whichever the last one is. And I feel we'd have the same if we tried to list all the candidates. I'm very much with James Brokenshire. I think that some people ought to reflect and consider that they don't have a chance of winning, that putting down a marker is not a serious way of approaching politics when we are facing a constitutional crisis. And so I would urge the candidates who know they can't win to think about their position and whether they are doing either themselves or the party any good.
You're supporting Boris Johnson in this race, of course, who today, or let's say on the day of recording, has released his campaign launch video. Do you think, is it this excess of candidates that's kind of muddying the process, or is it a fair criticism to say that the top contenders perhaps have been a little lethargic in this race so far?
Look, I think the large number of candidates is actually helping Boris because he clearly stands out from the field. No, I don't think that they've been lethargic. The campaign hasn't formally started. The nominations haven't opened. I think that a lot of subtle campaigning has been going on for quite a long time, even from within the cabinet, which isn't necessarily good form. But no, I think people often learn the wrong lesson of history, actually. It's absolutely classic that you look what happened last time and you think, well, I'll try that. Last time, people who stood for the leadership, by and large, got offered places in the cabinet. Say Liam Fox and Stephen Crabb come to mind particularly. Neither of them got a huge number of votes. And I think people are saying, well, if I stand, then I will warrant a place in the cabinet. But if we get to 22 people standing, there won't be any room for the Prime Minister in the cabinet in the end, will there? I mean, it gets ridiculous. And so I think it's an over-response to what happened last time, for people putting down a marker and thinking either next time or they will make their pitch for a senior post.
So, as you say, the 1922 committee have yet to officially open the contest, which they'll do by defining the rules and the schedule for it. One of the things being mulled in that decision-making process is the idea of trying to close out some of these smaller candidates by making a slightly stricter rule, requiring, say, 10 nominators rather than 2. Is that something you'd support?
It's a very difficult question. I was cautious on the proposal to change the rules to remove Mrs May because I feel changing the rules midway through always looks as if you're stitching things up. And I'd be cautious again about changing the rules when the contest date hasn't formally started, was expecting to go under one set of rules. And I think it is very difficult to do that. What I would hope is that candidates, once the votes have come in, will recognise that having a knockout stage one by one makes no sense, and that people who get under 10 votes must surely think to themselves, well, I got 3 and Bloggins got 2. Bloggins is knocked out, but what on earth is the point of my going on to the next round?
So if one was perhaps toying with the idea of standing in order to promote oneself, one ought to realise in some cases actually you could undermine your reputation by actually putting it to a vote. It was to prove almost embarrassing rather than affirming.
I think people who get under a dozen votes will look to have made an error of judgment in standing and will not enhance their reputations. I think that is true.
Another question about the design of this contest is this is the first time ever that a political party's membership will have chosen a sitting Prime Minister, assuming, of course, that it gets to a contest, which I think everybody says it must indeed. That's only Conservative Home's position as well. Is there a way to include the public in this process? There have been talks of having open hustings which members of the public can come to and ask questions about as well. For obvious reasons, I think a lot of people will be very wary of the idea of giving the wider electorate a vote on this after what happened to, say, Corbyn. But is there some way of getting some constitutional or democratic or popular perception of legitimacy behind it?
Well, I think Conservative Home should run a hustings for people to watch. You should take charge of that rather than it being done by the BBC. It should be done by Conservative Home and have a debate between the candidates or something like that. The truth is that whoever wins needs to appeal to the broader electorate. And Conservative members live within communities, and therefore they will be influenced by the public perception of the candidate, for better or worse. So I think that does come into it, and the ultimate goal is popular support. I think it's difficult when the general public is not an immediate participant to bring them in an informal way. But I would guess that any of the candidates would want to show their broader support to indicate to Conservative members why they're worth voting for.
It's definitely notable that Boris Johnson's launch video is largely him on the doorsteps. I guess at least some of those discussions during his recent visit to Peterborough, although I haven't confirmed that, talking to traditionally non-Conservative voters about where they would vote for him. Does the winner of this process really have to have an election quite soon as part of gaining that legitimacy?
Well, I think you're right to highlight that Boris has an enormous connection with voters. He's very popular on the doorstep. People are really pleased to see him, and there's great enthusiasm for him. Boris Johnson is the one Conservative politician who stops the traffic. People get out of their cars because they want to shake him by the hand and have a selfie. And that's a really powerful position to be in. So I think that is encouraging for Conservative MPs looking to win their seats. Does there have to be a general election? Now, I see that Paul Goodman's writing today saying that there must be, Monday, there must be an election. I don't think the Conservatives would be wise to go to an election before they've delivered Brexit, because they would lose. And so there is the conundrum, which Paul highlights, of to deliver Brexit, you need a different parliament, but you can't get a Conservative parliament without having delivered Brexit. And that is a real conundrum. And my guess is that a wise leader would try and deal with that conundrum whilst in office rather than risking an early election.
In what way? Is it possible to simply square the circle by being able to point to say, opinion polling having changed and say, were I to hold an election, we would win it? So Parliament ought to really recognise that actually I've changed the weather without having a ballot.
I'm not sure people rely on opinion polling that much.
Indeed.
What happened in 2017 when Mrs May went to the people and thought it would all be hunky-dory, and it was very far from hunky-dory. It was neither hunky nor dory. So I don't think that would convince MPs. I think there is the risk of a confidence vote, and that is a risk that can't be completely ignored, although I think it's very unlikely that any Conservative MP loves the European Union more than they fear Jeremy Corbyn.
So what is the way of squaring that circle while in office but without an election?
Well, you look at the one thing that has got through Parliament, which is the Brady Compromise. That, I think, would get through Parliament again. But you also look at the fact that the statute provides that we leave the European Union. Now, Ken Clarke was very interesting on the radio this morning, Monday again, saying that, yes, that's true legally, but the constitutional conventions would say otherwise, that if Parliament is against it. The problem is that the parliamentary conventions have been broken too, so you're in quite a constitutional muddle at the moment. And I think this is a very interesting question. I'm not sure I've got all the answers, and I'm not sure that the answers that I think are right would turn out in practice to be as easy to implement. But I think there is a route through within traditional constitutional methods that leads to us leaving on the 31st of October.
And finally, the elephant in the room, the unpredictable moving part in this week's news, of course, has just arrived in the United Kingdom, being Donald Trump, the President of the United States. He seems to have steamed in to have his say about what we ought to do about Brexit, which, as far as I recall, didn't go down that well when his predecessor tried it.
Well, I don't think he's told us what we ought to do, but he said that we shouldn't be frightened of being a great nation. And I agree with that. We shouldn't be frightened of being a great nation, and nor should the United States. And I think that this bold approach to politics is a good one. I've written a book on the Victorians, which I think we discussed last time round. And Palmerston is such a great figure because he's bold about being British and standing up for the national interest, and that's very important.
But Palmerston would have, I suspect, viewed it rather darkly had a United States president pitched up to say that actually the equivalent of Nigel Farage ought to be put on a negotiating team and we ought to do this and that in some kind of
Palmerston
talks.
would never have got himself into the position where he was kowtowing to the European Union.
Okay, so there wouldn't
So it would have arisen. No, it wouldn't have been problematic, though he was a great believer in a strong relationship with the United States.
He wouldn't have been dispatching gunboats to the east coast of the US.
Definitely not, no.
Is Donald Trump a benefit or a risk to Boris Johnson when he holds him close and implies that he ought to be leader and therefore Prime Minister? Is that something that goes down well with your colleagues, or for that matter with voters?
I think the key is that the relationship between the US and the UK should be as close as it can be made, and we want to have a Prime Minister who can get on with the President of the United States. And the President of the United States has said that he can get on with Boris and that he can get on with Jeremy Hunt. To be fair to Jeremy Hunt, he thinks, did he say he was a great guy or words to that effect? He's not so keen on Mr. Gove. But that is important in the national interest, that we have somebody who can do business with the United States. So to that extent, it's helpful. But I think a straight endorsement, which President Trump has not given, would be going too far.
So it might be fair to say the Boris campaign might be hoping to keep a little bit of clear air between the two this week.
Look, I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'm not speaking for the Boris campaign. But no, look, when Obama came over and he said, you're at the back of the queue, that was the best thing for Bay Leave that could have happened. It made everybody think we're not going to be told what to do by an American president who's not determining the future of the United Kingdom. And foreigners have to be very careful about what they say about domestic politics. They always do, and it's always wise to be cautious.
It's fair to say, I think Obama had his detractors as well as his fans. Donald Trump, I think, probably has rather more of the former than the latter in the country, in this country.
I think Donald Trump's becoming more popular, actually, because he's delivered huge tax cuts, and he's sticking to his promises as president. I think Donald Trump's standing in the UK is higher now than it was when he was elected.
And of course, the reason for his visit this week is not about Brexit, nor about United States, nor United Kingdom politics, but the commemoration of D-Day. Are you taking part in those commemorations this week?
Not in any formal sense, but you're right to mention it, because I do think the behaviour of people like Sadiq Khan is deeply disgraceful. That the president is coming over commemorating the sacrifice made by American citizens to ensure that the United Kingdom and Europe was freed from an evil tyranny. And surely we should be grateful for that and respectful to the country that fought on the other side of the world, not so much for its interest, but for the interest of humanity. And rude, cheap shots, particularly saying that Mr. Trump is like a 1930s fascist, is deeply, deeply disgraceful and demeans the office of Mayor of London and demeans the individual who says it.
Something for the Mayor to listen to and ponder this week, hopefully. So I think on that note, that brings our discussion this time to a close. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you as always. Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.